Some of the ground involved. Now, what I'm doing is I'm doing a series of bankruptcy documentaries. And before I get involved in this bankruptcy documentary, I'm going to explain a little bit about how I got involved in these bankruptcies. I never filed bankruptcy myself, but I've been involved in about 6 bankruptcies that other people have filed, other debtors have filed, absconding debtors have filed as a creditor in their bankruptcies. And after hiring a first attorney to defend my interests as a creditor in one of the original bankruptcies, I decided that, well, this is not going to work because they're going to drag these bankruptcies out long enough where they can run everybody into ruin. It's all in bankruptcy. Bankruptcy frauds are basically a fraud industry where the attorneys can pilfer almost all the money out of everybody involved, creditors, debtors, assets, and everything, and that's what they're after. It's a fraud industry. I got involved in the first bankruptcy, and we went over, and I learned through that bankruptcy, I learned how family farmers and individuals file bankruptcies, and the fraud involved, how it works and everything. And in one of the original bankruptcies I got involved in, I got involved in a corporate bankruptcy schemes, and this occurred by having a person that operated Fields Unlimited, which was a bankruptcy fraud company, come here to manage the absconding debtors' assets here to Washington, to manage absconding debtors' assets. And through investigating Fields Unlimited, this person that managed Fields Unlimited, that managed the absconding debtors' assets, I discovered he had been involved in his own corporate bankruptcy frauds down in Oregon. And I investigated him and his assets. Now, he ran a corporate farm down in Oregon. He also ran Fields Unlimited, which was a bankruptcy fraud scheme, which I managed to have the federal prosecutors determine it was a bankruptcy fraud scheme, and they gave him orders to cease and desist, but never made him repay any of the damage he caused to creditors. In investigating this person and the damage he caused to creditors, I discovered he caused damage to Harbor Community Bank, before it was Security State Bank, and Security State Bank, and Bank of the Pacific out in Long Beach. By what he did is he would buy the debtor's assets that he would manage the finances for next to nothing, or promissory notes, and then file the bankrupts, and all the assets were indebted to him, and then after the bankruptcy was over, he would turn the assets back over to the debtors. It's a bankruptcy fraud scheme. When I started investigating him, I discovered that he was sitting on about 22,000 acres of dryland wheat farm up out of the Dalles in Grass Valley, Oregon. I discovered in one of his original bankruptcies where he had bought about 10,000 acres of this dryland wheat farm it was an old family farm, and he bought it for, I believe, $2.5 million. And he declared bankruptcy shortly after he bought it. First, he got a loan from Northwest Farm Credit Services, which is the Department of Ag lending organization. And then he declared bankruptcy on it, and he defaulted on, when they bought the farm, they borrowed an additional $1.5 million in addition to the $2.5 million to buy the farm, to buy equipment. Then they transferred the assets from the equipment assets to a partner, and they sold the farm to a partner for $666,000 right after they bought it for $2.5 million. And they managed to execute this bankruptcy fraud scheme along with by transferring these assets into a third party. I need to back up a little bit. When they bought this farm, they had this. I discovered they had this thing called CRP payments connected with it. Now these are crop reserve payments, and these were paying this farmer, corporate farm, not to farm their dryland wheat. With this particular 10,000 acre portion of it, they were earning about $250,000 a year in CRP payments, and it was a 10-year contract worth $2.5 million. The government had determined these CRP payments were necessary so that these farmers that were in distressed rural areas could pay their loans. So the minute $2.5 million of government cash is involved, the predatory activity is on to get it. And this attorney that organized and managed this guy's bankruptcy fraud scheme, he immediately had the 10-year CRP crop payments deposited into his client trust account. From that client trust account, they disappeared. The $2.5 million was never used to pay back the $4 million that was borrowed. Instead, when what was actually borrowed was $3 million from the federal government, $1.5 million, there was an owner contract carried with the previous owner, and they lost out almost all the $1.5 million with the owner contract. The bankruptcy court wiped it out. And then they sold that 10,000 acre farm for $666,000, and with it, it had a $2.5 million contract with the federal government of guaranteed cash. At the time they sold it for $666,000.66. The debtor never left the property, continued to farm it, manage it as if it was nothing. Well, through my investigation and the help of my accountant, we investigated, we followed the money where the $2.5 million wound up going. And actually, we followed it for 20 years from the time that he filed the first bankruptcy, and 20 years of CRP payments went into the client trust account, the attorney's bank account. From that attorney's bank account, the court wasn't allowing us to follow the money out of the attorney's bank account, attorney-client privileges. But we managed to follow some of the financial trail of the debtor and the debtor's partner, who supposedly entered into a three-way partnership to buy the property, for an undisclosed three-way partnership, who bought the property for $666,000. Now, mind you, the $3 million from the federal government, that was loaned from the federal government, that money was never paid back. All but $666,000 of that money went away. You and I and the taxpayers paid that money. We discovered that the debtor and his partner who appeared to buy the property in a three-way partnership, most likely between the debtor and the attorney and him. He was in the construction business, and he was in the construction business, and he was a bank manager. And we followed him down to where he was involved in the creation of the First Western Bank of Nevada. And through the creation of the First Western Bank of Nevada, they financed him, who was a manager and a board on the First Western Bank of Nevada, to build condos in San Francisco and Oregon. And San Francisco just happens to be the home of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And I have to ask myself how many judges and prosecutors wound up with condos down there out of this deal. I strongly suspect, my accountant and I strongly suspect that the $5 million of CRP payments was used to start up, as a guarantee to start up the First Western Bank of Nevada. Now, shortly after the condos were constructed, the First Western Bank of Nevada defaulted for $158 million. We sure have a lot of bankruptcy frauds going around here in this bankruptcy crew. In all that fraud, the debtors, the corporate debtors, the corporations, were allowed to remain in control of the assets. When I reported the $158 million default for First Western Bank of Nevada to the FDIC, they indicated to me that it was small potatoes, there was bigger fish to fry. Personally, I think that the whole thing was designed to involve judges and prosecutors, criminal activity, and the federal judges and federal prosecutors and criminal activity, and the FDIC had to take it to federal prosecutors, and the federal prosecutors didn't want to involve their fellow prosecutors and bar members in the criminal activity. Unlike the local family farm bankruptcy, this bankruptcy involved millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. It affected this corporate bankruptcy. It affected the banks, our local banks, lost out money for it, and through this whole thing, the Twin Harbors area lost out no less than $10 million worth of commerce to the area. More, my guess is it was more in the hundreds of millions of dollars damage to the commerce of the Twin Harbors area. And when I'm elected to the legislature, I will deal with the details and the evidence that I have with this, because I have the evidence, I have the details, and I will show how the attorneys are making a fortune out of this bankruptcy fraud industry, an absolute fortune. There is no prosecutor or no judge or no attorney that's going to address this industry, the bankruptcy fraud industry. There's too much money in it for them. The only thing that's going to address this bankruptcy fraud industry, I guarantee it, is the people. And the people need to. All this is done outside the presence of juries, in closed courtrooms, behind the judge's robe. And this needs to end. We need to investigate these frauds, throw some federal judges and prosecutors in jail, without a doubt, disbar a bunch of them, throw some of them in jail for leading organized crime, and send a message to the federal government that we're not going to accept the damage to our commerce over this thing. We're going to address it, and we're going to address it aggressively and accurately. Thank you.